Testament, we find a world saturated in Greek culture. Paul often distinguishes between Jew and Greek. The New Testament itself is written in Greek, and there are just a dozen other examples of the ways that Greek culture has influenced things. For example, you see him quoting Greek philosophers. But where did that Greek culture come from, and how did it come to dominate Palestine in the 1st century? To answer that question, we're going to go look at about 80 years, maybe 150 years, starting with when the Protestant Old Testament ends, with the Persians ruling and the Jews able to return to Jerusalem. We're also going to talk about the root of why the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant traditions include different books in their Old Testaments, which is an indirect consequence of the spread of that Greek culture. Welcome back to The Thinking Believer and to part 2 of our series on what happened between the Testaments. Up to this point in history, the Greek world was ruled by city-states. Probably the most well-known of these in modern times are Athens and Sparta, but there were eventually more than 1,000 city-states, including Corinth, Thebes, Rhodes, and then about 990 that I had never heard of. Around the same time that Persia was ruling to the east, Socrates and Plato were living in Greece in a period known by modern historians as Classical Greece. And to briefly look even further west with a bit of foreshadowing, Rome was only this big at the time. When the Persians tried to invade Greece, many of these city-states banded together to protect their lands. I definitely oversimplified last time when I said the Persians were turned back at the Battle of Thermopylae. There was a lot more that went into it than that, but I'm also not really going to go into it this time either. After they turned back, the Persians, Athens, Sparta, and Thebes tussled for who would be the most powerful city-state, but none of them ever unified Greece. That was done by King Philip of Macedon. Macedonia was a kingdom to the north, not a city-state, but it was still very Greek, and Philip himself had been educated in Greece, coincidentally, while being held hostage in Thebes. In 346 BC, Philip unified the city-states of Greece, all except Sparta, for the first time with a little bit of fighting and a little bit of diplomacy, but probably mostly fighting. Modern historians refer to this as the League of Corinth. Then Philip was assassinated and the league dissolved for a minute until Philip's son, Alexander, who would later become known as the Great, put the pieces back together again with a couple very quick military victories. Classic Alexander. Philip had plans to invade Persia, which Alexander now put into action. In 334 BC, Alexander invaded the Persian Empire and conquered it in just 3 years. But he wasn't done there. By the time he quit, he'd conquered everything from present-day Greece to Egypt to the western edge of India, which made it the largest empire in the history of the world up to that point. As Alexander conquered his way across the world, he named 70 cities after himself, and 1 city after his favorite horse, and also himself. To give you a bit of perspective on how many cities that is, this is only 25 of them. The most famous of these cities was Alexandria, Egypt, which would later be known as the home of the Library of Alexandria, and by the time of Jesus would be home to more Jews than any other city in the world. Alexandria would also eventually play a significant role in the spread and shaping of early Christian thought. But cities named after himself aren't the only thing Alexander left behind. Everywhere he went, he brought Greek culture and language along with him, or if you're fancy, Hellenization, which is basically a word for becoming Greekish. That included everything from military and governance terms to art and philosophy. To give you an idea of how thoroughly this influenced the region, there was signage in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem written in Greek. Today, the buildings where Jews meet for worship are called synagogues, but that's a term that is Greek for gathering place and originated during this period. Christ is the Greek word for Messiah, which means anointed one. And the name Jesus, we get that from the Greek name Jesus, which was the Greek version of the Hebrew name Yeshua, or Joshua. When the Hebrew Yeshua is translated into English, it's translated as Joshua. But when the Greek version, Jesus, is translated into English, we call it Jesus. But they're really the same name. And man, as an aside, as I was pulling this together, I learned that the name Yeshua, or Jesus, means the Lord saves, which I think is incredibly cool given what Jesus was here to do. It feels like a Babe Ruth moment, God pointing to the outfield and calling his play. Watch what I'm gonna do. So there were lots of ways that Greek culture influenced the Jewish world, but the adoption of the Greek language in particular had a couple results that are worth spending a little more time on. The original language of most of the Old Testament was Hebrew, but even before Alexander, Hebrew was not the daily language spoken in and around Jerusalem. That was Aramaic, which had been the language of the Assyrian Empire and was consequently adopted by both the Babylonians and the Persians for governance in the area. Then, as Hellenization took root and Jews dispersed through the known world to places like Alexandria, there came a point when many of those Jews living elsewhere were more fluent in Greek than they were in Hebrew. As a result, the scriptures were translated from Hebrew into Greek, most notably into a version called the Septuagint. And when we hear New Testament authors or people they're writing about quote the Old Testament, a big chunk of the time they're actually quoting from the Greek Septuagint, not the original Hebrew Old Testament. I've actually learned over the course of making this video that that is a bit of a controversial statement for reasons we'll get to in a minute. In either case, as Christianity spread, especially beyond Judea, the Greek Septuagint was the definitive Old Testament because, as you can imagine, if even Jews didn't speak Hebrew, obviously non-Jewish Gentile converts to Christianity definitely didn't speak it. One interesting thing about this is it gives us a window into how some parts of the Old Testament were understood at the time. For example, in Isaiah 7:14, classic Christmas verse, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel." The Hebrew word for virgin can mean just young woman. But when this was translated into Greek in the centuries before Jesus, the Greek word they chose to use was parthenos, which only means virgin. That gives us an interesting glimpse into how at least the translators understood that passage right before the time of Jesus. One other big impact of the Septuagint is that some of the ways it differed from the Hebrew shaped the Bibles we use today. For example, Jews take the order of their scriptures from the Hebrew or Masoretic version of what we call the Old Testament, while Christians get the order of books from the Septuagint, from the Greek version. Not only that, the Greek Septuagint included several additional writings that weren't in the traditional Hebrew, which lies at the root of why Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant traditions have different Old Testament canons. At the risk of oversimplifying, the Orthodox Church stuck with the books included in the Septuagint, though my understanding is that even different Orthodox traditions will vary, and not all writings carry equal weight. The Catholic Church dropped 3rd and 4th Maccabees and a couple longer versions of books, and the Protestants excluded everything that wasn't in the Hebrew canon, or the Masoretic text. The Protestant decision to follow the Hebrew version exactly, and the Greek not at all, is the reason it can be controversial to say that Paul most often quotes from the Septuagint, or at least it was controversial with the OG Protestant reformers, because they were making their case for a smaller canon on the idea that the Hebrew was the most authoritative text, and if it's the text Paul most often quotes from, that case gets trickier to make. The last impact of the Greek language is the role it played in the spread of Christianity. By the time of Jesus, there was a common language that could be used to communicate across most of the known world. In the first century, Peter, Paul, or John could write a letter or hire a scribe to write the letter, and it would be understood pretty much everywhere. That's why the 21 letters and 6 books of the New Testament are in Greek, with a few Aramaic words here and there, not Hebrew or Aramaic like the Old Testament. Just like last month, I mentioned that God used the dispersion of the Jewish people across the world. I see the same thing happening here, with God perfectly timing his coming with a moment in history in which that news could spread most effectively because of this common language. When Alexander the Great reached India, his army basically told him they were done fighting and wanted to go home. So that's what they did. But Alexander never made it. He died on the way back in 323 BC at the age of 32, never getting to rule all the lands he conquered. Alexander's conquest also marked the end of what's known as Classical Greece and ushered in the Hellenistic period. Probably my biggest takeaway from this week is just a renewed respect for the ways that canons differ between Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant traditions. It's easy to sit and say, "Have you heard there's a dragon in the Catholic Old Testament? What foolishness!" But I think there are really reasonable justifications for the canon of each tradition, and I think it's important to bear in mind that we're not saved by having the right Bible. We're saved by Jesus. And none of the writings that are on the margins that either did or did not make the cut in these traditions change the core beliefs of the Christian faith. So that brings us to the end of Alexander the Great and how the world became Greek. Next time in our series, we'll be talking about what happened to Alexander's empire after his death, what that meant for the Jews living